Hello, everybody. Let's just wait for a few moments for everyone to arrive. If you all had a good day so far, I hope so at least. Alrighty, I think we can start now. Once again, welcome everybody to our new webinar. Today we are talking about on-premise to cloud. Should you make the switch? I'm Daniel, your expert from Go Bigger, and we shall start now. So, what are we actually talking about today? We are talking about the definitions and typical architectures in terms of comparing on-premise to the cloud. We are making comparisons between the two worlds in terms of tooling, ecosystem, backups, as well as cost considerations and future trends. At the very end, we are talking about a case study that basically shows at which point you should decide either to go with the on-premise or go to the cloud. Right, let's continue. First up, some definitions. We are talking about location, provisioning, the cost model, control and ownership, and maintenance. Let's start with the on-premise. Location-wise, we are talking about the organization's own data center. So everything is in-house. Compared to the cloud-based testing environment, we have the providers shared data centers or the global data centers spread out all over the world. In terms of provisioning, we're talking about physical servers or virtual machines behind a corporate firewall, as we said, inside the premises of the company. Compare that to the cloud-based solution. We are talking about on-demand virtual machines, containers, or even Go serverless, where you basically tell the API, here, I need this and that running there and then, and boom, you have everything set up. Talking about the cost model, we are talking about the two different aspects. In this case, the capital expenditure versus the operational expenditure. Let me gloss over that real quick. The capital expenditure refers to spending money in immovable objects. For example, like your offices, your premises in general, or in this case, objects in terms of servers and machines. Compare that to the operational expenditure, where we are talking about subscriptions and um, untouchable things, basically, where you, instead of you having a physical object, you have the license, right? So, in terms of the control and ownership, we have full control over everything basically if we are doing on-premise because the machine is in our premises. That's why it's named like that. You have full control over the network, you have full control over system security policies, everything is in-house, so you have full control over everything. Compare that to the cloud-based solution, everything is managed by the provider themselves. For example, the infrastructure, the auto scaling, which I will talk about later, and as well as the high availability, which is defined in the SLAs or the service license agreements. In terms of maintenance, in-house is always, not always, but most of the time, a patchwork. You have to upgrade manually, and you also have to think about your backup strategy as well. Compare that to the cloud-based solution, you get the automated security patches as well as the updates and built-in redundancy. In this case, we are talking about the big players and not some uh, unknown provider that maybe burns down the next day once you order their stuff. Right. That's about the definitions. Let's talk about some typical architectures. Um, in this case, we are talking about the physical aspects as well as the virtual aspects. In this case, in on-premise, everything is set up in hardware. We are talking about rack-mounted servers. We're talking about um, SANs or NASes in terms of storage. And we are also talking about VMware and Hyper-V or KVM clusters in terms of what the machines actually look like that you're going to use. Inside the cloud, we have the infrastructure as a service or IaaS. In this case, we are talking about raw VMs and networks, for example, AWS EC2 or Azure Virtual Machines, but you have full control over the operating system, even though you don't have anything you can basically touch, right? In terms of test orchestration, you're doing everything yourself on premise. In this case, we're talking about Jenkins, TeamCity, or Selenium Grid, for example. In terms of cloud, we are talking about managed platforms, for example, AWS Elastic Beanstalk or Google App Engine, which you've probably used before in terms of custom test deployments. Testing platforms on premise, on the other hand, are all locally installed, so you have to set it up and it runs the way you intended it to. If you misconfigure it, that's totally on you. For example, we are talking about JMeter or Selenium Grid, right? In terms of cloud, we have the SaaS, software as a service. It's fully managed for you. Maybe you've heard of it before. We are talking about Source Labs or Browser Stack. In this case, you have to pay per session or per minute provisioning. You have global regions, which could come in handy if you have distributed teams. You have built-in monitoring. You can have that on premise as well, but this is completely baked into the entire mindset of using the cloud, as well as having provider certifications in terms of security, because on premise, everything relies on you and your own security strategy. If you're using the big players in the cloud, they are certified, and they give you a certification that everything that runs on their machines is secured and accredited according to nationwide and even worldwide standards. Scaling and redundancy is a little bit on the iffy side of things. And on-premise solution, we are talking about you have manual capacity planning and hardware procurement, which can take a little bit of time if you are not planning in advance that you can expand further down the line. On the other hand, you have the cloud, where you have the elastic auto scaling, you have the geo-redundant data centers, and SLA-backed uptime guarantees, which you cannot have if you are running the on-premise version of it. Right, so that's the groundwork laid up for you. Let's talk about when to use what. In this case, we are talking about the on-premise. If you have a strong emphasis on data protection and ownership, go with on-premise. If you want close to 100% consistency, choose on-premise. If you have a defined scale and no need for upgrades further down the line, go with on-premise. If you want a set and forget solution, go with on-premise. On the complete other hand, when you should choose the cloud, if you need scalability, in this case, auto scalability with no need for actual hands-on stuff, go with the cloud. If you want to get started ASAP as soon as possible, go with the cloud. If you are a little adventurous and want to try out the latest tech, go with the cloud. If you don't want to maintain the hardware yourself, go with the cloud. One thing I wanted to bring up, by no means I'm like an aficionado for the cloud, but in this case, there are many topics where the cloud outshines the on-premise solutions nowadays. talking about the two worlds. We are talking about scalability and flexibility. In the case, we have the fixed capacity in the on-premise version versus the elastic scaling that the cloud provides. It can also handle peak loads much more easily over the cloud, where it can distribute all the workload instead of having everything running basically on one machine. Setup and deployment time, which I basically grasped over a second ago. We have the procurement and the installation timelines that you have with the on-premise solutions. On the other hand, you have the instant provisioning inside of the cloud, so you can deploy as soon as possible. Maintenance and upgrades. I already talked about that a little bit. We have the in-house patching and version control. Yes, you have the full control over everything, but yeah, it has to be done manually. On the other hand, you have the automatic updates and managed services inside of the cloud, which basically handle all the heavy work for you. Performance and reliability. Yeah, you have the network latency and on-site infrastructure stability in terms of, yeah, you can access your data anytime you want. But as time progresses and internet gets more stable by the day, that should not be that much of an issue nowadays. Inside of the cloud, we have the global availability zones, which basically assign machines to you or workforce for you that is set up in a way that you and your premises have as much availability as possible instead of having machines like on the other side of the world. I mean, that can also be a use case for you if you want to go worldwide, for example. But in our example, we stay rather locally. Right. Speaking of security and compliance, if you go with on-premise, you have physical access to all of your data, which is stored on your hard drive normally. Yeah, and also you have your internal policies that no one can define other than yourself, and you set the boundaries for everything that works or does not work inside of your own premises. Compare that to the cloud. You have the cloud provider certifications. For example, you have ISO, you have SOC, GDPR, you name it, everything. All the big players are certified with everything you want. And if not, you can always have SLAs that cover everything else. Compare that to a huge topic, at least in Germany, data sovereignty and privacy, where you have complete jurisdiction over your on-site data, on-premise, of course. In the cloud, we had the situations that stuff gets hacked, your data gets lost, or maybe someone steals it and whatnot. Right. That's where you have to step in and come up with a protection plan yourself for the cloud version. If you have everything on premise, no one can access it as long as your VPN does not get hacked. But let's not think of that. That's the chaos situation, which we are not covering today. Right. So that's a huge plus for the on-premise situation. Talking a little about the tooling and ecosystems and backups. For example, we have the popular on-prem test frameworks. For example, JMeter for performance testing. We have Selenium Grid for your distributed testing. On the other hand, we have cloud-native testing platforms, for example, AWS Device Farm or Source Labs, which I've mentioned before. We have the collaboration and remote access. In this case, we are talking about on-premise stuff with VPN and firewall complexities that can come up if you are using the on-premise version of it. On the other hand, we have cloud, talking about browser-based dashboards and global teams. Everyone can access the stuff if given access, right? And controls everything, for example, via the browser or the command line, which is a huge plus. Then comes the worst thing that we all have to think about, disaster recovery and backups. We all heard of it. We don't want to experience it, but we have to accommodate for it and have to plan for it. On-site, on-premise, it's relatively easy to have your on-site backup strategies If you are thinking about like making a backup every day or every night, then once a week, and then once a month, and so on and so forth. So having your backups on site is always easily available, and nothing can happen to it besides your premises burning down, for example, or whatnot. But let's not think about that. On the other hand, you have the cloud version of it. You have built-in redundancy and you have geo-replication, which means you can get your database completely replicated by the blink of an eye somewhere else completely different than your place all over the world. So that's a huge plus for that in terms of availability and in terms of recovery. A huge thing that no one should miss out on is the cost considerations. We were talking about that earlier. The capital expenditure versus the operational expenditure. So investing in hardware versus investing in licenses. Once we go over the case study, we will see when it makes more sense to go with the on-premise version and when it goes to the cloud version. Hardware procurement and maintenance, always a huge thing. You have to maintain your hardware. You have to get it somewhere. On the other hand, you have pay-as-you-go pricing, which can lead to huge invoice numbers because you clicked somewhere wrong and instead of ordering one VM, you ordered 100 for whatever reason. Of course, you can always cancel them and you get billed by the minute, for example, or by the session. But stuff can happen, you know. People make mistakes. And you can always return hardware, but once your license is bought, it's there, at least for the moment, right? It's a little bit more difficult to return a license in this case. The cost of ownership over time, right? You have to buy the hardware once, that's correct, and you have to pay a one-time fee, but it has to be maintained. Sometimes hardware fails. You have to get another stick of RAM, for example. A hard drive fails. So there's so much that goes into it. One thing that many people miss, power bills, huge thing in Germany. Cooling. We have global warming, you know, everything wants to be cooled. So that goes into it. Also, people have to administer all the different patches and whatnot. So you have to think about staffing as well. There's so much that goes into it besides like getting a license from a cloud provider and having everything set up for you. You just have one fixed price per month, or if they raise their prices for whatever reason, you have to pay that. But the costs are defined. There is no real, you wonder why that happened. Right. So let's quickly gloss over the case study that I wanted to share with you. We have company A that wants to stay with the on-premise version. They're completely locked out from everything else. They just have everything there for themselves and they do their testing on-premise, so no cloud. Then we have company B that basically do the same, but they go with the cloud route. Everything is basically the same, so we have comparable numbers at the end of the day. In this case, we are talking about a 5-year time span, and I will share some information with you regarding that. Here in this graphic, you can see the test throughput over 5 years. In the orange color, you can see the on-premise company, company A, and on the, now let's call it darker orange, you can see company B with cloud testing. Start off is basically the same at the 1-year mark, but as time goes on, the cloud testing accelerates. There are many topics to it, but at the very end, the more you want to test, the more hardware you need. And what holds you back in this case is the provisioning and setup process and whatnot for the on-premise stuff. Because let's face it, the more you want, the more you need, right? And if you want to test more, the more hardware you need takes time. That's where the cloud accelerates. talking about the cumulative cost over 5 years. In this picture, you can see we have a break-even point. What does that mean? At the 2.6 years mark, roundabout, we have the situation that the before saved costs with the cloud testing and whatnot gets bigger than the on-premise cost. Why is that? Yeah, of course, you have to pay upfront for the on-premise hardware, but you have to pay for it once, like the bulk part of it. Let's not talk about the maintaining of the hardware. In this case, we have 2.6 years, 2.5 years maybe. You have already paid your stuff, and the cost won't get much bigger than that. If you go with the cloud, you have to pay every month for your subscription. That does not get lower. It probably gets higher after some time. After this 2.6 years mark, the subscription costs are bigger than the on-premise costs with the hardware and the maintaining and whatnot. So you have to keep that in mind over this relatively short time span, 5 years, and basically right in the middle, the costs get outweighed. Let's talk about numbers real quick, so you have a little bit of an insight regarding that. First year, everything 100, like 100 tests executed on-premise and cloud. We're talking about on-premise costs $200,000 in this case. We're talking about thousands of US dollars, and the cloud cost $100,000. If we look down the list from the cloud, it's relatively what would we call it? It does not grow exponentially, but the steps are rising much bigger than the cumulative costs of the on-premise. You have to pay upfront. $200,000 are paid upfront, and the increments are much, much lower. In this case, we're talking about $60,000 per year in terms of the costs per year that get added to the cloud. We are talking about 100,000. So we are doubling up, right? If you want to go long term, in this case, go with the on-premise route, because otherwise you're gonna pay more than you earn at the very end, right? That's just one case study. It could be that your team has different metrics, right? So has to be checked on a case-by-case basis, right? Not everything works on your company. Maybe it works on another company, right? Let's talk about future trends. In this case, we are talking more of the cloud side of things. AI-driven test automation in the cloud. Our fine colleagues of the company Imbus have implemented a tool, for example, that is AI-driven test automation, which basically uses the cloud. What is it called? Test bench, right? So that is something that only the cloud can provide for you. The work power that is basically endless is only available in the cloud. If we are talking about a little bit on a distributed workforce, we're talking about edge computing and testing. What does that mean? Instead of having your workflows everywhere, we are talking about edge. And that means only the outer layer, right? We are distributing the workforce also to your own devices and not just the cloud. So you're basically doing a hybrid between both worlds. And that is where we can accelerate. That is going to be the future that most of us going to use. If you have ever used ChatGPT, it uses that as well, right? So if you have a slow device, ChatGPT, yeah, it's huge and whatnot, but if your device is slow, then it's not going to be that fast for you as well. Right. Okay. So let's continue on with the summary. On premise, when should you use it? If you have a single location where everything is basically in your own office. if you have a strong emphasis on data protection and ownership, which we talked about before, if there is a need for close to 100% consistency because you configure everything, you have the power over everything, you have a defined scale and don't need upgrades anytime soon. So you don't need to provision more hardware, right? If there is a need for a set and forget solution, once you set everything up and provide it with the appropriate security patches and whatnot, it works. There is no one touching it other than you. So once you set it, you can forget about it. It just works, right? If you go the route with the cloud, when do you use that? If you have distributed teams, if there is a need for scalability, if there is a need to get started ASAP instead of waiting for provisioning, way to set everything up and whatnot. If there is a need not to maintain the hardware yourself, if you want to say, yeah, I'd rather pay someone and it just works, right? That's when you go with the cloud route. And if there is a wish to incorporate AI into processes, right? Of course, there is local AI, but let's face it, the local AI can never beat the distributed systems and the brains of the cloud AI, right? But there is a huge but. You could always go the hybrid way. You can use and mix everything that fits your needs, basically. You can have one part locally and another part in the cloud. No one is stopping you from trying out both. You can get the best of both worlds. For example, edge testing and edge computing is something of a hybrid. So why should we stick to just one solution? We could go both ways, right? Okay, so that basically wraps everything up I wanted to tell you. Have you any questions? Do you have any questions for me? Do you have anything to comment on? I give you a minute so you can think about, and please don't hesitate. Don't be shy. You can always ask questions. There are no dumb questions. Okay, I see no questions in chat, so let's continue on. Thank you everyone for listening in. My colleague will share the links with you. First of all, thank you very much for tuning in. If you would please be so kind, give us a follow on LinkedIn. That would help us very, very much. As well as check out our courses and workshops that we spend so much time on working on and want to provide you for everything you need in terms of testing and test automation. For example, our relatively new robot framework course. You can check it out under go-bigger.de/shop. My colleague already sent it out in the chat. Check it out. And if you want to have the latest news and all the updates regarding Go Bigger and testing and test automation, you maybe want to join our monthly newsletter called Grow Bigger. No worries, if you join, you can always cancel your subscription. There is no cost associated to it, and we won't bother you other than once per month. So please check it out if you want. And yeah, I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it and take care.